Good evening. It's so wonderful to welcome you all. It's actually a great pleasure to welcome you back to the art gallery at Western Wyoming Community College. This is where we kicked off the Abraham exhibit. It seems like just yesterday, but it's actually getting ready to move to Laramie, and we'll be opening in Laramie, I believe, on April 9th. So we're coming to the end of the Rock Springs tour, but we wanted to end this portion where we began, right here in the art gallery, with the beautiful, beautiful paintings of the Abraham Out of One Many exhibition for you to look at. And we have a very, very special guest tonight. We first brought him when we did the bridge back in 2016, and Rock Springs and the community, from the students all the way up to all of us, fell in love, and each time we have an opportunity to bring Baktash back, he seems to have something new and something different to share about his worldview, which is so amazing, and the experiences that he has had, which are so overwhelming, and the perspective he brings to it all. He has so much to teach us all and so much to share with us all, and so it is my really great pleasure and my really great honor to welcome, not just on behalf of the diocese, but on behalf of Sweetwater BOCES, Baktash Ahadi.
اوکی مهربانی برنید. سلام علیکم کلگی. شما چطور هستین؟ اسم ما بکتاش است و بسیار خوش هستم که در این گالری هستم. میخوام تشکر.
Baktash, I'm very sorry, but I think we didn't communicate. Baktash, I couldn't afford the interpreter. You got that? No interpreter.
راستی؟
No interpreter. I am so sorry. You know, times are tough, but my budget was, I had to cut the interpreter. You think it's easy to find somebody that speaks Farsi? That was hard.
Yes.
That was hard. Baktash, do your best. Do your best. No interpreter. Do your best.
Got it. Okay. English. English. Okay. Okay. I think I could do that. Okay. Lovely. Okay. I hope you guys all like that. My mother tongue is Farsi, and it's wonderful to be here. I'm really, really happy that Bernadine essentially introduced me. Delighted to be here in this gallery amongst so many beautiful paintings for this exhibition. And what I'd like to do is speak for about 15 minutes or so and then open it up for a conversation, because I believe a conversation is the single most important tool that we have to essentially cultivate understanding. So I'm going to speak for a little bit and then I'll open up for questions. So as I'm speaking, please take mental note in terms of things you'd like to ask me after the fact. Okay? So as I mentioned, I'm in the midst of so many beautiful paintings in this exhibition, and I have to ask the question, what is artistic expression? What is it about? And in my opinion, it's about interpretation. It's an invitation to make the art yours. It's about interpreting the world through the artist's perspectives in the hope of understanding their message to the world. In fact, it's an offering of gaining a greater perspective. And so what I would like for you to do is, I would like to put you in the shoes of my parents. My parents, their story begins by being born in Afghanistan in the 1950s and 60s. And they were born into a world that was completely isolated in some sense from the rest of the world. In fact, that was probably the case for many parts of the world at that time. And as they were kind of growing up and essentially becoming adults, what ended up happening was the Soviet invasion happened in Afghanistan. And that's where the beginning of this 42 years of war that now is in Afghanistan started. The war started in 1979. And I was brought into the world in 1981. What happened was that my father's life was put into danger. And he came home and told my mother to pack our bags and get ready to leave. And what's really interesting about my parents' story, my mother's story in particular, is that she hadn't left her neighborhood her entire life. This will be the first time that she had left her neighborhood. So it'd be fair to say that my mother didn't know what she was getting into. So lo and behold, that day, my father comes home, gathers our things, grabs me, my mom grabs my brother, and we get into a cab and we leave Afghanistan. We leave Kabul. We go to the outskirts of the city. And At the time, my father had ties with the Mujahideen. And if you remember, the Mujahideen were fighting against the Soviets in Afghanistan. So as a matter of world history, the United States was supporting the Mujahideen through the Pakistani government to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. That's how the United States was linked to the war in Afghanistan at that time. And what's really interesting about this is that my father, before he met my mother, my father was born in Kandahar, Afghanistan. You may know Kandahar because it is the birthplace of the Taliban movement. And so it's deeply notorious for being that place. Yet it's the place in which my father was born. And what's really curious about my father's story is that he fell in love with the idea of America before even coming to America. You see, my father was taught by a Peace Corps volunteer whose name was Eric. And my father learned English from Eric that essentially allowed my father to then work for USAID in Kabul before he met my mother. And so this will matter a little later in the story. So as we're leaving Afghanistan, we're on horseback, we're on donkeys, we're being led by the Mujahideen through the Hindu Kush mountain range for 7 days and 6 nights. It's fair to say that this trek was treacherous. People often, I'm speaking to you from Rock Springs, which is here in Wyoming. And what's beautiful about Wyoming is that it's the home to the Grand Tetons. The Grand Tetons are very special from the Wyoming side of the mountains, because as you look at them, they jet out from the ground and they're deeply, deeply, deeply beautiful because of it. They're sharp, they're jagged, they're rough, yet they're magical. The Grand Tetons are beautiful because in many ways, the mountains of Afghanistan, the Hindu Kush mountain range, resembles that of the Grand Tetons and the Rockies here in Wyoming. So imagine traversing and trekking through these mountains. That's what my parents did with 2 young boys, me and my brother. So lo and behold, with the graces of God, we eventually made it to Pakistan and spent 2 years in makeshift homes in various refugee camps in Pakistan. Eventually, my family made it to Islamabad. My father had the great idea of going to the consular office at the American embassy and presenting his case to try to get his family out of Pakistan. You see, at the time, the Afghan war against the Soviets was in full-fledged force. So there was no option for us to go back. And Pakistan was not a place in which my family wanted to stay. So lo and behold, as the American saying goes, if you ask, you shall receive. And so my father was given a form to fill out to make his case to essentially come to the United States. And they asked for references. And my father listed the references from his time working at USAID in Kabul. And lo and behold, the Foreign Service officer, the American diplomat that was in charge of my parents' case, my family's case, accepted us to become political refugees in Afghanistan. We were granted asylum to come to the United States. In fact, what ended up happening was the consular officer found an organization that was going to sponsor my family. And that organization was St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. My parents didn't know what the Lutheran Church was. They didn't know what Carlisle, Pennsylvania was. All they knew is that we were going to go to America, which made them deeply happy. Because you remember, my father fell in love with the idea of America before even coming here. So one thing led to another. We got into a plane and we made it to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And as we're coming off of the plane, 20 people or so are welcoming us to Pennsylvania. And these 20 people were members of St. Paul's Lutheran Church. In fact, these were the people that were going to help my family assimilate into American culture. So everybody was responsible for different things in terms of helping my family assimilate. One family was responsible for helping my mother go to school. Another family was responsible for helping my father drive. Another family was responsible for helping my father find a job. And so everybody had a different responsibility. And the first few years were very difficult for my family because you have to understand, they had just left everything that they knew about the world. They left their religion, their language, their homes, their families, their sense of identity in some way was left behind. They were in a completely new place. In fact, they were in a place that resembled something that they never thought they'd essentially be in, meaning When my parents, as I talk to my parents now and I ask them about that time in which they were coming to America, I asked them to describe what they expected when they were arriving. And they would say, they do say that when they first came, they expected every place in America to have tall buildings, flashy lights, everybody had a car and nobody really worked yet, everybody had money. The American dream, so to speak. What's not depicted in Hollywood films, which is where my parents got a lot of their information about America, is that in America, people work really, really hard. And in America, there's a lot of diversity if you're in the right places. And so the place in which my family landed, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in the 1980s, was very homogeneous. It was a small little college town where the majority of the population were Caucasians who were Lutherans or Christians of some sort. And there were denominations of other religious groups in and around Harrisburg. So why is this important? My family was sponsored by St. Paul's Lutheran Church. And so what ended up happening is we started going to St. Paul's on Sundays. And we started going to St. Paul's on Christmas Eve and on Easter and on religious holidays. And we started to learn about the faith of Christianity. And we started to engage. Again, at this point, I was a young boy. I was 5 years old when I came here. But I distinctly remember my parents being in conversation with the pastors of this church, asking them questions about their faith. And conversely, people of St. Paul's Lutheran Church were asking my parents about Islam. In this conversation, I remember, not only took place in the church, it took place in our living room. On Sundays, people would come to our homes. Christians would come to our homes. And at this time, we'd spent about 5-6 years in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and we found some Jewish families. And they came to our homes. And we ended up going to people's bar mitzvahs and going to a Jewish temple. And it was really interesting because as a young boy, I was exposed to all these different faiths that came from one individual, Abraham. The idea that one individual essentially spawned 3 monotheistic faiths was really interesting because at the end of the day, through all this conversation and all this engagement and all this inquiry, we realized there was a lot of commonality. It just took different shapes and different forms. And these faith-based religions manifested depending on the environment which they were practiced. And so that's the thing that I remember distinctly being observant of as my parents were slowly trying to assimilate to American culture. Now, some of the lessons that I learned from this experience, I'm currently in the process of writing my memoir, which is not just my own story, but the story of my family. And some of the lessons that my parents, as I'm interviewing them for this book, for this memoir of mine, are the following. My parents' life story is really about adaptation, right? The world is going to change and you have to change with it. In some sense, what my parents did is they didn't know anything about Carlisle. They didn't know anything about Christianity. They didn't know about the world in which they were going to with 2 young boys. Yet they were willing to embrace the unknown, right? Not only of the world, but of others. And then in this process, they were willing to embrace who they were in relationship to these new things that they were learning. So they were learning about themselves as well by being in these situations, by being in these conversations, by being in these homes of worship, so to speak. Not only were they learning about these faiths that were very different from theirs in some sense, or perceived to be different, but they're also learning about themselves and how they understood those religions and or those faiths. And so there's multi-layers in terms of what's happening as a matter of reflection and understanding and learning, okay? So the first lesson was adaptation. The world's going to change, so you have to change with it. Because if you don't, you're stuck or you're stagnant. And then if you stay in that position, the world's going to leave you behind. That was a foundational lesson that my parents taught me about the existence, the nature of human existence, okay? The second lesson that my family and my parents taught me was be deeply curious about the world. People have gifts and they have stories and they have things to offer you that you cannot believe or you cannot begin to imagine. There are things that your parents and your brothers and your sisters and your neighbors know how to do that you keenly unaware of. And it's not their responsibility necessarily to show you, but I think it's our responsibility in some sense to be curious about what they may know as a process to finding a deeper, more meaningful relationship with those that we're in company with. Moreover, my parents taught me that not only do people have gifts and learnings that they can teach us, but though also is that people suffer in ways that you cannot begin to imagine. Meaning, my parents, when they first came to the United States, they thought to themselves, everybody does well here. Look at these cars, look at these homes. Again, my parents are coming from a place that was relatively impoverished and was on the brink of war when they first left, and now is in complete chaotic war. What does that mean specifically as it pertains to my parents' story? In conversation with people that my parents got to know in Carlisle, people had things that they were dealing with that had nothing to do with Afghanistan, with Islam, with Farsi, with the things that my parents understood about their own identity and their own story. But yet, people were suffering in ways in which my parents could not begin to imagine. People dying from cancer, people losing relationships with their siblings and their children for trivial reasons. These were things that my parents weren't necessarily exposed to, but there are ways in which people suffered that my parents essentially learned about. And through this process, my parents' sense of loss was in some way diminished because they learned by being engaged in conversation with people that others are suffering in ways that they don't necessarily demonstrate to you off the face of the conversation. Okay. And the third lesson that's really important that my parents learned and that they taught me was you always have there's the lesson of chance versus choice. What do I mean? In the context of human existence, there isn't much in life that we have control over. If you really think about it, there isn't much that you have control over. For example, you can't control how you were loved as a child. You can't control how you let go of work unfairly, how you were fired. You can't control being lied to. You can't even control where you're born into, or the family that you were born into, or the language that you were born into, or the faith that you were born into. So what is that telling us? We're being judged in our lives for things that we can't control. Okay? And that is not only unfair to us, but it's also unfair to the person making that judgment because they're casting me and or others off as somebody that they can't learn from, or that they can't essentially be in conversation with for a reason that they believe to be true. That's not only unfair to me, but it's also unfair to the relationship that we could potentially have. So what's the other option? Everybody has a choice, right? In the context of everything that we do in our lives, if we can't control the things that happen to us, what we do have a choice over is how to interpret the meaning that we give to the things that happen to us, right? Or how we want to react to the things that happen to us, right? And in that space, there is a moment or a sense of freedom that everybody has on this call and on this planet. We always have the ability to choose how we're going to react to the environment that we're in. And we always have the choice to, in some sense, edit the story of our lives, to revisit what it means to be Baktash Ahadi. Asking the question, who am I, is actually a very deep question. And the reason why is because you can always edit your response. You can always generate a new response depending on how you want to be in the world. Okay? Now, for those listening, this may seem very disconcerting, but it's foundational in order to know to be a better person to yourself, for yourself, and the world around you. Okay? So over the course of 2020, I made my objective for the year to have really deep, intimate conversations with my parents and with those that I was in relationship with, that those people that I came across with online and sometimes even in person. And there were a few powerful questions that I found to be very useful in terms of how it shaped me and how I wanted to be in this world and how I wanted to make sense of it. Okay. And in short, these questions have helped me shape who I want to be, help my family, and then help others be better. So I'm going to share them with you because you may find them useful. Okay? The first question is, what's the relationship that I want to have with myself? The second question is, what's the relationship that I want to have with the world? The third question is, what's the type of person that I actually want to be? The fourth question is, how do I want to be remembered? The fifth, what will I regret not doing at the end of my life? The sixth, what do I want to think about while I'm actually here? What's worth thinking about? And lastly, how do I want to grow? I think this experience is really about digging deep. It's really what this experience requires of us. This is what it means to explore the landscape within. It's the art of growing up. So if you take the time and energy to do so, you'll come out a more wholesome, grounded, and more authentic person. So just as these artists in this gallery allow us to essentially give us an invitation to revisit the interpretation of their worlds via these paintings, I'm offering you an invitation to revisit the story that you tell yourself about the world, about who you are in the world, and about foundational questions about what it means to love, how you want to be, how you want to be remembered, and the type of person that you actually want to be. Because at the end of the day, nobody has a choice about where they're born, how they're born, and the places in which they're born to. But we always have a choice to choose how we want to interact with the world around us. And in that lies freedom. And in that lies power. So that's my invitation. And so with that said, I'd like to open up this part of the conversation to Q&A, to essentially hear the questions that you may have, so we can have a discussion about some of the things that I've shared.
I guess my question is, as you raised the various questions, I wondered about including the question about not only your relationship to yourself, but I'm curious why you didn't have the question, what is your relationship to God?
That's a lovely question. Thank you. Your name is Mark, sir. Thank you for asking that question. So the way I kind of think about it is, the second question that I asked, what is your relationship to the world, encompasses the idea of God and your interpretation of God. Because at the end of the day, for me, that's what it resembles. The idea of universe, the idea of the world, the idea of God is quite literally everything that's outside of our perceived notions of ourselves. And so that's kind of how I think about it. And again, if using the word God is more pertinent or more, if it lands better with you, if that's something that settles better with you, that's great. The way I kind of think about it is, in the context of language, you can use various language to kind of help you navigate the world that you live in, right? So in the context of this conversation that you and I are having, I'd be delighted to essentially pursue that question with you, or hear the response that you may have as it pertains to that question. Does that help a little bit? It's really just a preference of language.
I can see where you're coming from. Indeed, thinking about the idea of what is your relationship to all of those things outside of yourself, I think makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. What if I didn't have this bottle of water? Because this is the reality for billions of people around the world. We may complain about something, but always remember that somebody else would be deeply grateful to be in the shoes that you're in right now. And so that is the beauty of travel, and that is the beauty of being exposed to people that don't have the same things that you have, because it's a wonderful reminder that life could always be worse, and that we should be deeply optimistic and grateful for things that we have, because again, we are born into situations that are completely out of our own control. And so that is something I would love for you to kind of think about as you kind of navigate the world that you're in. The difference between having and not having, the difference between first world and third world. Good.
Millions of people in the world cannot choose new lives for themselves due to the breadth of man's inhumanity to man, political, economical, social oppression. What would you say to an audience of people who are fundamentally stuck in the circumstances over which they have no control?
Yeah. This question reminds me of one of my personal heroes who's no longer alive, but his name is Viktor Frankl. And his book, Man's Search for Meaning, changed my life. And it's important to talk about Viktor Frankl because his life is a lesson that we can all learn from. Viktor Frankl was a Jew who was in Auschwitz during World War II. He was captured by the Nazis and he was kept in Auschwitz. And the conditions that he was in for close to 9 years were completely dire. He almost died of starvation. He lost many family members along the way. His wife, his children, his parents, his brother. He quite literally had nothing left to live for. Yet, he was able to make it out of this concentration camp after the Nazis were defeated. And he went on to write this book called Man's Search for Meaning that he wrote in 9 days. He then subsequently went on to become a psychiatrist to help people with their problems. And he says something very, very important. He says, this was the message that he had for people in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He says, you can't control what happens to you. Oftentimes the world is completely cruel to you for reasons that you have no control over. But in between the stimulus and the response, your response, there's a space. And in that space lies freedom. You can choose how you want to interpret your sense of reality and interpret your reaction to the thing that's trying to defeat you. And having this mindset will teach people, if you adopt it, that you are stronger than the thing that's trying to defeat you. And so what I would offer anybody who's listening, or anybody who's in a place where they feel like this is their reality, where they can't change what's hurting them and what's trying to defeat them, is to say, what you need to do then is your sense of responsibility to yourself is become stronger, so you can essentially have a better way to kind of react to this stimulus. Because then, if you're able to withstand, there will be some movement. If not, you will fulfill a sense of purpose through suffering. And that's another thing I'd like to add too, is in the context of the United States, quite literally the most prosperous country in the history of human existence. We can have anything in America, yet this country also has the highest rates of suicide. And we have to ask, why? How is that possible? The country that I was born into, Afghanistan, doesn't suffer from suicide, yet people live in squalor and they live in uncertainty. And they live not knowing what's going to happen to their children or what's going to happen tomorrow, which means they can't plan for a future. They can't build a future. So we have to ask the question in the context of the United States, how is it that people are getting to the point where they feel like they have to kill themselves to escape this misery? And one of the reasons I believe that exists for this epidemic of suicide in America is, in some sense, we've gotten too comfortable. We don't have a struggle to fight for. So what I mean to say is, choose the thing that you're willing to suffer for. Are you willing to suffer for your children? Are you willing to sacrifice for your children? Are you willing to sacrifice for your life's purpose, for your work, Are you willing to sacrifice for your sense of health? What is the thing that you're willing to suffer for? Because in that space, you will find a sense of purpose. You will come out a stronger, better person. And so I think that's something that we've lost here in some sense in different parts of the United States is we've lost the wanting or the ability to suffer for the things that we care about, right? And so that's the thing I would like to offer people in terms of a perspective is if you can't change your environment, change how you understand your environment and or your relationship to your environment. Because in that space is where you can find freedom and also a sense of purpose if you're willing to suffer for it. I hope that helps.
This one actually is coming from a FaceTiming couple.
Great.
One of them is in Cheyenne. The other one is in Bakersfield, California. It's our own Jeremy and Sandy Caldwell. So they have come up with a trans-state question for you here.
Great.
Okay, they want you to talk about your experience when you were a young person making these kinds of amazing transitions during an age in your life when, as a young person, you're probably also questioning everything familiar, everything about your family, their spiritual experiences, their religious experiences, their economic experiences. And how did that feel like? And how did you navigate it? She says, it's really the intersection of first world problems with the problems of a developing world in the mind of the person coming into his own. How do you reconcile the apparent divergent concepts?
What a lovely question. What a lovely question. I think the thing that's surfacing for me as it pertains to that question is the idea of coming into oneself or the idea of meeting yourself is very interesting. I'm in a place in my life now where I'm trying to be the hero for the child that I was when I was young. Because in some sense, you know, my parents were in a place where they were working and they were trying to find a way to survive. They're trying to find their way in America. And they assumed that their children were going to be all right because they're no longer in war. They're no longer in a place of complete uncertainty. They could go to preschool and kindergarten. And in these places, they had food for their children to eat. And so my parents' thinking, and I know this because I've asked them, was that our kids are going to be okay now. And what's interesting about that is we were okay to a point, meaning those fundamental things that they were concerned about were covered. But the things that they weren't able to think about, because I think they were too going through this in their own minds, was psychologically, how could they and or we be safe? And that's the thing that wasn't on their minds. What I mean to say is, as a young boy in the context of living in a place like Carlisle, Pennsylvania, I was the only person that looked like who I looked like, meaning I was the only person that was not Caucasian, not white. And as a young boy, you only know what the world tells you about yourself. I think that's really important. Children are beautiful because they're innocent, but they're also very vulnerable because they're innocent. And so what's interesting about that is children only know what people tell them about who they are. And children only know when they're doing something wrong if somebody tells them they're doing something wrong. Or vice versa, if they're doing something right, people tell them that they're doing something right. This is what it means to be a child. And then slowly but surely they come into their own. What's interesting about the experience that I'm kind of talking about is my own lived experience as a young boy is the world told me in some sense that I didn't belong by physically beating me up or making fun of me or calling me names. And what's really interesting about that is I remember as I'm writing my memoir, I remember those instances in which I was getting beat up, but I don't ever remember crying. And what that taught me as a person who's reflecting now as an adult on that little boy who I was that in some sense I believed I deserved it because nobody told me otherwise. Why else wouldn't I be crying? So why is this important? You may not believe this, and for those that know me here, may find it very shocking that I was a deeply shy boy. I didn't talk to anybody. It's deeply shy. It's deeply shy. If you ask my parents now, they'll tell you I was extremely shy. And it's because I wasn't able to navigate the world that I was living in. At home, we were speaking Farsi. At school, we were speaking English, except I didn't know how to kind of step into English. I didn't know what was right. I would say some words and they were wrong. I actually was held back in the first grade because I didn't know the language. And all I was trying to do as a young boy was mirror everything that everybody else did, because that's how I got by. I remember copying math problems off other students' worksheets, except their math problems were completely different than mine. And so the teacher started to realize that this boy actually isn't learning. And so what was coming into my mind in terms of English wasn't resonating because I didn't know the language. It was very interesting. And so so to answer the question, I was having a hard time navigating these things. Kids at school would have these really nice backpacks and I wouldn't have these things. And I didn't really know how to kind of navigate this. What's more interesting is I didn't even know how to say anything about it. There were just kind of data points in my life. But then something happened. I mentioned that in first grade I was held back because I didn't know the language. And so what's interesting about young people is a year in a young person's life is a long time. Not only as a matter of time, but also as a matter of growth. So what did that mean? By the time I was in fifth grade, I was bigger than the rest of the kids. Not only bigger, I was stronger and faster. So what did this do? I went from being chosen last on the kickball team or on the soccer team to being chosen first. And what does that do to a psychology of a person? It gives them a greater sense of confidence. Like all of a sudden, not only can I kick the ball in that net and in that goal, but what I can do is now I can be in a place where people see me for who I am, not just what I do. Young people, what's interesting is, as a matter of maturity, I think adults do this too. We judge people based on who they are, not what they do. That's all children really know how to do, is they know how to judge based on what people are, not what they do. This was a transformational moment in my life where I started to realize, oh my God, people actually see me now. I am wanted. I am desired. I'm chosen. And that gave me the confidence that essentially allowed me to come into my own. It allowed me to step into a place where I started to essentially have the voice that I have now in some sense. So that's how I came into my own, through a matter of physiology that was valued in this environment where sports were valuable. And that's the beauty of sports. And that's the beauty of sports diplomacy is, if you ever watch the World Cup, teams? They're made up of people from all over the world, except they're wearing American jerseys or French jerseys. What's really interesting about that is, in the context of the United States, I urge you the next time the World Cup happens is to ask your question. That's an interesting last name. I wonder where that player hails from. My sense is they're probably from a different country. And as it kind of folds into this idea of what America is, what's interesting about the concept of American is people ask other people where they come from and if they're American. What we're actually asking is, what's your nationality? But we're treating it as though it's an ethnicity, and that's wrong. Because if we're talking about what American means, the only Americans that are here are the Native Americans. Everybody else upholds Americanism as a nationality. So I want to make that very clear in terms of a distinction. There's the nationality, and then there's also the ethnicity. So as you kind of navigate this world that we live in America, remember, people can be American and not speak English. People can be American and not be Christian. People can be American and not have served in the military. They can be from a completely different place. And so that's the realization that I came to is growing up and coming into my own is, people would always ask me, are you American? Of course I'm American. What they're actually asking is, what's my ethnicity? That's a different question. So I hope that kind of helps shape the way in which I came into myself as a young person and navigating the world that I was kind of brought into. was I didn't know who I was, but sports was the catalyst for me to kind of help myself find the voice that I essentially have now. Because people want to live, people not only want to live, but they want to win all over the world. That's universal. That's universal. That's universal. So Jessica, on your end, do we have any questions on your end?
We have lots of questions on my end.
Great,
Yes.
please.
Yes.
Please.
Have you been back to Afghanistan? How do you see the nation's future from an American perspective? Is there a spiritual answer to your questions?
That's a great question. So Afghanistan, unfortunately, yes, I've been back. I went back for 3 years as a combat interpreter, working with the Marines and training the Afghan military to go after Taliban insurgents and Al-Qaeda insurgents. So I was there on the front lines of America's longest war in my home country with my new adopted country. And that's the premise of my memoir, is I'm writing about this experience. Because in the context of war, unfortunately, interpreters are forgotten, whether it's the Afghan war, the Iraqi war, World War II, any war that you kind of think about, we're really not given a voice. We don't really matter. And so I hope in some sense my story brings light to this. So yes, I've been back. I went back for 3 years. Now, as it pertains to the question of how do I see the country? Well, I think in the context of Afghanistan, the country is going to get worse before it gets any better. Unfortunately. The reason for that is a matter of politics. The United States is deeply interested in leaving the country. And so if the country is left, meaning if the United States isn't there to support the Afghan government, to finance its security forces, to defend itself from insurgency, to defend itself from terrorist organizations that want to create networks, camps, essentially have safe haven in Afghanistan, then the United States in some sense has to stay engaged, meaning it has to essentially have a pulse on what's going in the country, because if not, the government will collapse. And if the government collapses, then we're back to square one and another 9/11 could potentially happen. Okay? This is deeply important for people to remember, because we went into Afghanistan because of what happened on 9/11. The attacks on 9/11 were planned and orchestrated from Afghanistan by Al-Qaeda. Once the United States was attacked, George Bush, if people remember, George Bush reached out to the Taliban and said, listen, we don't want to have anything to do with you or your country. We just want to go after this insurgent. We just want to go after this terrorist group. And the Taliban said, if you want Al-Qaeda, you have to go through us and you have to come through us to essentially get them. So what's interesting is people in Afghanistan realize this. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But the thing that I think everybody has to kind of think about is, in this day and age, the world is more connected now than ever before. What happens in other parts of the world reach here. The world is more connected now than ever before, right? And so that's the thing that I think people have to remember. And so the United States has a moral obligation in some sense to keep a pulse on a place like Afghanistan and other countries that essentially could negatively affect not just people of that country, but also the rest of the world. So I hope that makes sense.
All righty. Next question. Do you get asked about the book, The Kite Runner, and any similarities in your family's experience? How did you find the book, or did you read it?
Yeah, I love the book. Yes, I've read it. And yes, that story of a family coming to America, finding their own, and then going back to Afghanistan to essentially fulfill a responsibility, I think is an experience that happens for many immigrants that come from my background, in particular, many people that come from Afghanistan. And so I think the immigrant experience is very similar for many people. The idea of coming to the United States, trying to find your own, and then going back in some sense, trying to fulfill a sense of responsibility for the country that you were born into. For those of you that haven't read it and you want an idea of what it means to come from a place like Afghanistan or understand the Afghan narrative, I deeply recommend it because It'll change your perspective on a country that in the media is perceived and deemed to be a place of terrorists and violence and conflict. The thing also to kind of remember is human beings are deeply resilient. And even in the context of a place like Afghanistan that's completely chaotic and uncertain and war-torn, people will live their lives. People still have and celebrate birthdays and births and weddings. Human beings are deeply resilient in that way. We always find moments to essentially celebrate joy, even in moments of darkness or in places of darkness that could be. So I want people to kind of remember that too, is that human beings are really, really good about finding ways to essentially celebrate little things in their lives. And to be honest, half of my family still lives in Afghanistan, and they do. They live their life. They do it from a different framework. They find deep meaning in suffering, whereby they give to their children, they sacrifice for their children. They find a deep sense of faith in Islam in the context of Afghanistan. They look to God and spirituality as a way to kind of find peace with the environment that they're in a very different way than some people in different parts of the world. So for those that are essentially curious about a place like Afghanistan, the kite runners are a really great start to kind of start the process of understanding people from that region of the world.
Hi, this is actually Nina, Elizabeth's sister.
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
I know.
Hi, greetings from New York City. And first, I just want to say thank you very much. Tashakkur mikonam. I actually with an organization that works in northern Afghanistan. I'm also a returned Peace Corps, so your story touched me on a few levels. So like many likely tuning in, I grew up in the church, and now I actually work with an organization around religious diversity and inclusion. And given how interacting across religious differences is very much part of your own life experience, and we find ourselves now in times that perhaps beg us even more to interact and build relationships across difference. I wonder if you could speak to how we can take this reflection and the insights and compassion and take it even more into the realm of action in difficult times across differences.
Yeah. Thank you, Nina. That's wonderful. So I think the single most important thing, based on all the things that I kind of think about, the things that you brought up, Nina, is not only be adaptable, not only be curious, not only understand the power of choice and how you want to interact with the world, but I think action starts with engagement. So for those that are deeply curious about the world, kind of want to figure things out, what's interesting is I ask this question a lot now, but I want to ask it to everybody on this call and people in this room. Can you think of a time in your life where you weren't the protagonist of the film that you're directing? The answer is no, because you are the thing that you see. You are the thing that you live. And so why is this important? As you think in the context of filmmaking, something that I'm deeply passionate about is that as a viewer and director of a film that you're in, what's interesting is in filmmaking, there's what you see in front of the screen or on the screen, but you don't see everything that's behind you. And that can be perceived as what's happening to a person. Or when you see a person and you talk to a person, they're only showing you one side of them, right? And as you spend more time with them, you learn to understand that there are more to them. There's a sense of wholeness. They become more wholesome in your perspective because you get to learn more aspects about them based on their experiences and their opinions. Why is this important? What am I getting to? What we have to do is we have to engage with others in such a way where we're actually trying to come to a place where we're learning about their lived experience. I don't know what it's like to be a white male from Kansas. I have no idea. In fact, I have no idea what it's like to be a woman who is from Nigeria who now lives in New York. I have no idea. But what do I have the power to essentially do? I have the ability now to essentially say, hey, I actually want to know what it's like to be you. Help me understand what your lived experience is all about. Explain to me in a way where we can both come out of this conversation more informed, whereby you reveal something about yourself that you haven't revealed before, and then I learn something about you in that process. And it all comes down to 1, engagement. 2, asking questions that get to the heart of the matter. For example, a question that could fit that definition is, what is your lived experience? What are the things that happen in your life that make you believe the thing that you believe? Why do you support this this person in politics? What about your experience has led you to believe that this person is the right person for the country, for the city, for our community? Because if we ask questions in those terms, then what we're doing is we're inviting people to start a conversation where we can both learn. And I started this, my presentation by saying that I believe that conversation is the most important tool that we have to come to an understanding. We have no other tool. That is the point of conversation. So Nina, I hope that helps in some senses to say, start small, but start with engagement and start with really, really, really powerful questions that allow for an invitation for people to open up and say, my name is Baktash Ahadi, and this is my lived experience. This is how I've been shaped, informed by my upbringing, by my nation, and by the people that I've been in company and relationship with. And I think that's a good starting place to essentially have that revealing where people can come out better on the other side by learning from each other, about each other, and for each other. Does that help? I hope that helps.
Yes, thanks so much.
Thank you, Nina. Tashakar Shamal.
Baktash, what, in your opinion, is the way to heal the split in the great religions of the world?
Yeah, I think the question goes back to Nina's question. It's about understanding that religion, in some sense, is the story of religion. It's a narrative about where we came from and where we're going and how we should live. And what's beautiful about the human existence is we can essentially edit parts of that narrative that speak to us and resonate for us in the way in which we want to live and the ways in which we want to be better. And so that's kind of how I think about it. That could be useful for other people, is to say, what is the story of religion that you're essentially subscribing to? What's the story of religion that you essentially want to have and uphold and you want to share with others? Because I think the moment we kind of say this religion and that religion, what we're saying is this way of living, that way of living. And when we think about it in different terms, the terms that I like to think about it is story. And what's beautiful about story is you can always edit things that speak to you in your lived experience. Because if you take somebody from, for example, the kind of Islam that my family practiced or was born into, it's very different from that of somebody, let's say, from Jakarta, Indonesia, or from a Muslim living in Chicago. They're variations on the same theme. But what's important is to say they're variations. No religion anywhere in the world is a monolith. That is impossible. People take from religion based on their lived experience. And that's why I always say this term, lived experience, because it helps me and helps others kind of navigate, okay, Bernie, John, Dave, and Carl are speaking from a place of how they were raised and how they understood their religion based on the environment that they're living in. And so I think that's the starting point. I think it's using different terms, it's reframing the conversation, and it's coming together from a place of learning versus judging. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing to learn when we judge people or we perceive to understand somebody based on how they look or based on the label that they give themselves about who they are. I'm a Muslim from Afghanistan. Imagine if I said that, and that's all I said to everybody on this call and everybody in this room. And then I asked the question, how do you think I am? What type of person do you think I am? My sense is all the responses would probably have nothing to do with what I presented to you today in my family story. And so I think that's the starting place for understanding, is coming together and saying, okay, I want to have a conversation with you not from a place of judgment, but from a place of curiosity. Because we're human beings. And if you're not curious, you're not growing. And so the way to kind of implement that is through engagement and through questions.
Knowing that Carlisle, Pennsylvania is also the place of the Carlisle boarding school, it is amazing to hear you carry this story out of Carlisle. And to me, I hear a spirit of healing and from generational trauma. Can you please speak to the concept of healing from generational trauma?
Yeah. As a matter of epigenetics, research now tells us that trauma lives in the body and it's transferred from one generation to the next. Right? This is something now that's coming to the forefront, and now, and that's deeply positive because now we have something to work with. The research tells us that although we weren't part of something, we are now the recipients of it. Okay? And so the way I like to think about trauma, the way I like to kind of think about all the things that we were born into and the things that we didn't have a choice over is to say, okay, we're in a place in our lives where, we just spent the last year isolated with loved ones or by ourselves completely. And so we still have a lot more time before we're out of this thing, which allows for an opportunity. I think the opportunity is that we have now the space to sit there with ourselves and say, what exactly am I dealing with? What are the things that happen in my life that I'm not proudest of? What are the things that happen in my life that are of no fault of my own? And if you ask these fundamental questions about yourself, you will find quite literally a place where you meet yourself. I don't think life is linear. I think in some sense, the purpose of my life at least is to be the person that I've always been. Right? Society is fantastically amazing because it tells you all the things that you should be. And in the world of information where there's no longer a monopoly over information, everybody has information all the time in their own pockets, right? So what we have to do as individuals is to say, I'm going to essentially drown out this noise that's being shared with me and shared toward me and say, who am I? And then once we start having these conversations with ourselves, one of the major questions that I presented earlier is to say, what's the type of relationship that I want to have with myself? How do I essentially want to confront the demons that live inside of me? Everybody in this room and everybody on this call has those demons. You may give them another term, but that's the term that I'm giving them because I once heard that if you don't confront your demons, they're in the basement lifting weights. Meaning they're getting stronger. So we can either do this now or we can do this later. And if you're completely running away from it, then you're never meeting yourself. And I think the purpose of life in some sense is to meet yourself. And that folds into the idea of generational trauma, because if you start from the perspective of, this isn't my fault, this is the thing that I was born into based on what happened to my parents and what happened to them. And remember, trauma is something that is shared. It's not one thing that happens to you in isolation. Trauma is because of what happened to you in relationship to somebody else. I can't have trauma alone in a room by myself. No, trauma happens when somebody does something to me that was unfair when I was a child. So it takes two people. Trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum. So if you start thinking about it in these kind of terms, then you have a starting place in which to kind of understand how to think about it. So we've named it, we know what it is. I've spent a lot of time alone. This is the thing that I've been dealing with. Once you name it and you find it, then you can figure out, okay, as you're kind of navigating the world, you're like, okay, this thing that happened to me is surfacing. And once you start to notice that it surfaces, you then have a choice. You can either let it overtake you and let it be the person that you don't want to be again, right? We've tried that and you're not happy with that person. You can have that path, you can take that path, or you can say, I'm going to let this little boy Baktash who was traumatized on the school ground surface, but then I'm just going to say, you know what? I'm no longer that person. I'm more confident. I believe I deserve more. I don't suffer from a sense of inadequacy because of who I was in the place that I was. And so I think what I'm saying is something very, very simple. Sit down alone, figure out all the things that you think you're unhappy with and the things that you're born into as a matter of trauma. Figure out what that thing is. You can seek the help of a therapist or a friend. But my sense is if you spend a lot of time alone writing about it, you'll figure out exactly kind of what that is. And once you do that, then you have a starting place essentially to kind of deal with that trauma that essentially will surface. It will never go away. The responsibility that you have at that point is to figure out how to manage it. And everybody has it. That's the thing, is everybody suffers from it in some way or another, right? Whether it's trauma they've dealt with in their own lives or something that was passed down to them. Because remember, people suffer in ways that you can't begin to possibly imagine. And so I share that with you because I think it's important to kind of remember that we may think our problems are specific to us, but there's something very universal about suffering. The moment you share them, people will come up to you and say, that was my lived experience too. That was my parents' lived experience. And now I have to deal with it. And so it's really important to kind of open up once you have the courage to be vulnerable and say, this is what happened to me, or this is kind of what I'm dealing with. Because then you'll find out that you're not actually alone in your suffering. You'll find that you'll be able to find many friends in that place. And so that's kind of how I've dealt with it. And that's kind of how I started my healing process. And I hope that's useful for you too. Any other questions, Jessica? What do you got?
Where do you personally find your strength?
What a lovely question. I really like that question. Where do I find my strength? Yeah. So as it pertains to generational trauma, as it pertains to finding oneself, as it pertains to meeting oneself, the thing that's surfacing for me is, in some sense, what I want to do is be the hero to the boy that I was. Meaning, as a young boy, I found myself wanting to feel like I was safe and that I belonged and that I was worthy of other people's attention, worthy of other people's love. And what's interesting about that is, now that I've named it, and now that I was able to essentially find out that this was the root of what I like to call my fundamental sin, the thing that surfaces in my life, where I'm in a place that this little boy shows up. I feel like I'm inadequate. I feel like I'm undeserving. As an adult now, I've been able to name it. So what I realized is, in some sense, my life purpose is to be the thing that I didn't have. In particular, be the thing that I didn't have when I was most vulnerable. And so my strength comes from realizing how much I've grown and making sure that I can be that, not just for myself, but be that for other people too, in the service of others. And the way I kind of do it is, this is something that's personal to me, is I don't have my wallet on me, but in my wallet, I carry a little picture of who I was when I was a little boy. And sometimes I'll pull it out and I'll look at it and I'll say to myself, okay, I remember who I was and I remember how much I've grown. And what's interesting is, as young children, if you think back about who you were, you'll realize all the things that you didn't have and all the things that you wanted. And so in my journey, the way I kind of think about it is, I try to be the hero for the person that I was when I was a kid, because I know I needed him. And what's interesting is, as I share this story about myself, I find that other people need that too. And my strength comes from confronting my demons, knowing how difficult it is, and then having the courage to share my story, because I find that other people need it too, and other people feel those things. So what's really interesting about the human condition is that the more particular you get about your story, the more universal it becomes. This is a fantastically interesting universal law that I've learned. And I think there's a lot of strength in that. So dig deep in terms of who you are and what your lived experience is. And once you kind of, found that arc of your life story and all the things that you didn't like about it, then that's a starting place to essentially confront it. And as you confront it every single day, you become stronger. I personally want to be better to myself, my family, and those that I'm in a relationship with. And so in order for me to be better, I have to be stronger. I think that's where it comes from. Being vulnerable starts with courage. And I think that's the lesson that, you know, my parents have taught me, that the world has taught me, and that I've taught myself by sitting alone and really digging deep into the things that I believed I knew about myself. But in fact, I realized I had the ability to kind of change over time. I hope that's helpful.
I'm just interested in, well, one, thank you for your service. My father was a Marine, so it's a pride, but also you came from a rich, beautiful, religious, I guess, melting pot. So do you have one that are you still Islamic, or are you Christian or Jewish? Or
No, that's a lovely question. Oh God, that's a lovely question. What are you?
not that any of
I love
it's
that
wrong.
question. Yeah, what are you? No, of course. I appreciate your question. You're very sweet. So I am born Muslim, and I will die Muslim. And what's interesting about that is I come from the Islamic faith tradition, and so in many ways my sense of identity was formed with those values. But what's beautiful about my lived experience is that at a young age I was exposed to values of the Christian faith and values of the Jewish faith. And what's interesting about that is, as I was exposed and as my family was exposed to different faith traditions, what my parents and my family realized, what I personally realized is, not only is there so much commonality, but there's also this idea that, you know, the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, would I be of this faith if I wasn't born into it? You know, how much of this faith is based on my parents' association with this faith, or my grandparents' association with this faith? And so I share this with you because, you know, I was born to Muslim parents in a Muslim majority country. And in terms of a respect to my family lineage, I will leave this world in an Islamic way, with an Islamic funeral and burial. And I go to houses of worship, not just the mosque, but I go to Jewish temples as well as Christian churches. And I spent a year in India going to Hindu temples as well. What I've learned is, from the moment we're born to the moment we die, we have the choice in terms of how we want to be in the world. And the way I kind of want to be is, there's always a way to kind of learn from different faith traditions and bring that into your own. The label isn't so much important, but it's more about how you kind of want to be in relationship with, I like to call it the world, and some people like to call it God, some people like to call it Jesus, some people like to call it Ganesh. It totally depends on how you want to call it. But for me, it's understanding that there's a universal oneness to the world. There's a universal oneness to the world. And I think even atheists or agnostics will subscribe to that as well. And I think that's the starting place in which I come from. And that's kind of how I think about my faith and my relationship to my faith. Is, I think Islam is just a label, or Christianity is a label, but it's more about, you know, how do you kind of think about God and faith in a broader sense that's not specific to what you were born into or what you were exposed to or what you're exposed to now. I'm not sure if that makes any sense. I hope that's helpful. That's kind of how I think about it. But I love the question, what are you? I love that question. I love that. What are you? I have to know, what are you?
Have you and your family been able to visit much of our country, or has Pennsylvania remained your American home? There are areas and particular cities where we do have diversity in all areas of life.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. So I spent 7 years of my 20s abroad, and I came back, and I'm 39 years old, for those that are curious. So I spent the last 7 years after coming back from Afghanistan exploring much of the United States, doing talks in places like Rock Springs. And I've been to places like Memphis, Lexington, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Berkeley, Princeton, Charlotte, Columbus, Georgia, Atlanta, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, I've been to 34 different states in America, and some of them twice or three times. And America is fantastically diverse, more diverse now than ever before. More diverse now than ever before. When my family first came here in the came to the United States in the 1980s, globalization had yet to happen. It was very difficult for my family to find the foods that we loved, the music that we loved, and anything else that resembled our home country, meaning Afghanistan. That now is no longer the case. Now that everybody has a phone, you can find your sense of community wherever you are, even in Rock Springs, in Southwest Wyoming. You can find your sense of community now. It's much easier now than ever before. And as you kind of travel across the United States, sure, people are different all over the United States. But again, what's interesting about human conversation is that the more you get to talk to people, the more you realize we're all exceptionally the same. More so than ever before. I mean, more so than you could possibly imagine. Everybody has a love for their children. Everybody wants their children to be better than them in some way. Everybody wants to be a good person. This is something that I've learned is people actually want to be good. Some people just don't know how. Some people just don't know how to be good. So yes, and this is the thing that I've learned about spending all this time traveling across the United States, is that America is unified in its diversity. And the thing that we have to understand is remembering that America is a nationality, and asking somebody else, whether they're from Mexico or Afghanistan or whatever, is an ethnicity, right? Asking somebody where they hail from or what their lineage is, whether they're Scottish, Irish, English, German, Costa Rican, is asking where somebody hailed from. So this is the thing that I've learned, is that it's really important to kind of define terms, because that kind of helps you navigate the world a little better. And it's really important to kind of, English is my second language. And so I've always been interested in language in that way, because I've always, it's just helped me better understand how people think about the world. And so, what I would also advocate in this part of the conversation is to say, what are the words that I like to use all the time? What are the words that I hear all the time? Let's revisit what the word passion means. Let's revisit what the word love means. Let's revisit what the word friendship means. Let's revisit all these fundamental things, because you'd be surprised what you learn about these words, whether it's the history of these words and where they came from and how they've morphed and how we even use them. Right, here's an example. Here's just a really quick example. Young people often hear the question, what's your passion? It's a thing that kind of, I'm sitting in here in a community college, and so it's really kind of interesting to think about this. And what's interesting is people also ask, have you found your passion? And I urge people to revisit the word passion, because it quite literally means the thing that you're willing to suffer for, or the thing that you suffer for. Meaning, we use the word passion and love or happiness sometimes interchangeably. And I'm not sure that's right. So if you haven't found your passion, it's okay, because 98% of the world hasn't found it either. So don't feel like a failure. But two, this is just an example of how we use words and we assume what they mean, except they've changed. And so I ask people, I invite people to kind of think about language in those terms. We're like, are we using the right terms? What does democracy mean? What does American mean? What does value mean? What are my personal values? What does faith mean to me? What is my actual definition of God? How would I describe it? And write it down or say it out loud, because you'd be surprised what you think you know and what you actually may not know. It's a good little exercise. So the answer is yes, I've seen a lot of America. The answer is yes, I've seen a lot of America. Yes, yes.
How and where did you sense or feel compassion? What is a compassionate message people need to learn from Islam?
Yeah, I like that question. So let's define compassion. Compassion in the context of what we're describing is to suffer with somebody, right? Or to suffer with somebody else. It's the idea of choosing to suffer with somebody else. So in the context of Islam, a major value in the context of Islam is the idea of service and the idea of giving to others, particularly the idea of forgiveness. And so in the context of my family life and the way my parents and kind of the way in which my parents essentially lived their own lives is my parents are to this day, I called my father yesterday. I was trying to get him on the phone to tell him that I was safe and healthy in Western Wyoming. And I couldn't get him on the phone, so I called my mother instead. My mom said, "Son, your father's out helping the new batch of refugees that are in central Pennsylvania." You see, my family was the first family that kind of arrived in central Pennsylvania from Afghanistan, but now there are many, many, many more. And so my father, as a matter of service in terms of giving back, he is now the point person for many different refugee organizations in central Pennsylvania that are placing people all across the state. So what does he do? In the context of compassion, the context of service, he's there to help them explain what America is all about, sharing all the things that he wished he had known about America when he first arrived. Lessons that essentially my parents and my father have learned about what it means to be in this new country and the values this country has relative to the values in which people had come from, the country in which they came from. In this context, Afghanistan. So in these moments I've gone with my father to work with these refugees, and the questions they ask and the stories they tell are fantastically interesting. You know, for example, the story that's kind of coming to mind is this one woman that my father was helping, and her children. She had lost her husband in the war, and she came here with a suitcase with the clothes for her children, a few clothes for herself, and she had a rice sack in her luggage. There was no rice in the rice sack. It was just the rice sack. It was completely empty. And my father asked her, "Why did you bring this? Why did you bring this with you on your journey?" And she said, "It's the only thing that I could bring that would remind me of home." And so this idea of compassion is like, you know, people are willing to tell you their stories about how they've lost so much. And I think compassion is service, but it's also the ability to radically listen to what people have to say. And to say, why do you have that? What is that all about? And people carry things with them, whether it's a photo of themselves as a child or rice sacks that tell you about how they value the world in such a way that's completely different than yours, that could actually inform your life in a better way. So I think compassion is really about going to a place of suffering with somebody else, or at least wanting to know what another person's suffering is. And this comes from my parents' lived experience in the Islamic tradition, which they were born into and that I was born into. So this is a lesson that I've learned from my parents. I hope that helps.
Just on behalf of the Diocese of Wyoming and everyone here, everyone at Western Wyoming in Rock Springs, we just want to really thank you for coming and once again, just making us think, making us aware of who we are, and making us realize how easy it is to embrace the stranger.
Thank you, Bernie. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you. God bless you. Thank
God
you so
bless.
much. Thank you, everybody on the line. If anybody wants to reach out to me specifically, what you can do is you can look me up. You can Google me, Baktash Ahadi. It'll take you to my website, and you can, if you're curious about other things that you haven't had a chance to kind of talk about or share, reach out to me via email, and we can start a conversation. Okay. Thank you, everybody. God bless. Thank you.